That's one small step for man, one giant leap to reach the top level of platforms. It's Tengen's Covalent Pair on NES Works episode 150.
As for you, I'll be back up here in an hour, so you better not be.
Sega's final NES release via Tengen brings us something unique in the world of video games. Perhaps the world's only port of a Master System game to NES. Certainly, nobody else unleashed anything quite like Tengen's version of Shinobi on the poor, unsuspecting gaming populace back in the day. We've seen plenty of games across NES Works and Segaiden that appeared on both NES and Master System. Despite many first-hand claims from licensors back in the day that Nintendo had a strict no-compete clause for third-party releases, some publishers took a breezy DGAF attitude to those restrictions, and lightning didn't strike them down where they stood. Most often, the NES version of a multi-platform game varied significantly from the source material, usually something you saw with arcade-to-console ports, or at least stood apart from the Sega interpretation. Consider Rampage, which had fewer stages and a different overall flow on Master System than on NES. Or Spy vs. Spy, which included many play elements that made it more accurate to the computer game on Master System. Or Strider, which wouldn't hit Master System for a while yet, but would be more a one-to-one adaptation of the coin-op than the ambitiously sloppy NES Metroidvania. You get the idea. When it came to multi-platform video game releases, Master System and NES had almost zero overlap, even when they shared titles in common. Shinobi here is the exception, and that is because Tengen, you see, absolutely did not GAF about Nintendo's rules. I mean, that was basically their entire thing. Of course, Tengen also did not GAF about licensing and intellectual property laws, which proved to be a bit of a problem. But when it came to the NES version of Shinobi, the company broke all the rules and no one suffered for it. They FA'd and never FO'd. Well, that's not true. Anyone who paid their hard-earned American dollars for the NES version of Shinobi came away filled with regret. It's one of those cases where you kinda wish Tengen did GAF, at least a little bit more in terms of quality. Shinobi on NES plays exactly like Shinobi on Master System, except that it's weirdly wretched. On Master System, Shinobi stands out as being perhaps the console's last good arcade-to-home adaptation, at least of Sega titles, or at least in the US. The ports beyond Shinobi attempted to push that poor, wheezing hardware to recreate the actual visuals of Sega System 16 and export machines, relying heavily on the use of animated, interactive background tiles to create a sense of scale that the console couldn't achieve with sprites alone. As we saw with Altered Beast, those efforts looked great on the back of the box, but they moved and played pretty horribly. Shinobi managed to avoid committing that kind of party foul by sticking primarily to sprite-based interactive elements, like a normal-ass video game would. This meant that Shinobi inherently looked more like an NES game than the usual Master System fare. It scaled down the size of its hero and his enemies, shifting the proportions of the characters within their environment in a way that may not have looked as cool as the arcade rendition, but had real integrity to its action. Was it diminished in a sense? Yes, but really only visually. In terms of playability, it turned out great. So, by all rights, the NES adaptation should have been a slam dunk. Take those Master System graphics, rework the color palettes, add another 30 rows of vertical pixel resolution, and recreate the other version's physics and mechanics. A straightforward and seemingly simple formula for success, right? Well, evidently not. Someone dropped the ball with this conversion, and somehow Shinobi on NES plays as clumsily as those background tile-based arcade ports on Master System. Shinobi on NES is in fact about as fun as Altered Beast on Master System, which is to say, it isn't. And it doesn't even have the big beefy boy graphics or hidden FM synth soundtrack of Altered Beast to soften the blow. It's just pure bad times all around. Where to begin? Shinobi on NES just fails at everything it attempts to accomplish. Poor Joe Musashi gets around like he traded his mastery of the ninja arts for a case of ninja arthritis. The animation and frame rate have a sluggish quality matched only by the game's reluctance to recognize the player's control inputs. Every button you press results in an action on screen much later than seems appropriate for a fast-paced ninja combat game. I have seen Punch-Out running on a bad HD television through composite video and relying on the TV's internal upscaler, and that still felt snappier and more playable than this version of Shinobi. It's almost comical at times, especially once you reach the helicopter boss at the end of Stage 2. I won't lie, I cheated and used an infinite lives code on this one because it took me about a dozen tries before I could brute force my way through the game's sluggish responses, exceedingly generous enemy attack hitboxes, and utter lack of mercy invincibility to cheese an attack on the chopper without getting butchered by an infinite swarm of goofy pogo stick ninjas. Even basic combat details like Joe's mastery of both ranged and melee attacks come with unhappy asterisks here. The whole thing about Shinobi was that Joe could seamlessly and contextually switch between short and long-ranged attacks as the situation warranted. That was a really cool and unheard of feature in 1987. It made Shinobi stand out and positioned it as something besides a pure shooter or a pure brawler. Here though, you rarely see Joe strike with kicks or katana. He simply doesn't want to shift his focus from toss and shuriken. And when he does, you can understand his reluctance. Joe's short-range attacks have a paltry hitbox, even for, short-range attacks. As with everything else about Shinobi on NES, you feel like you're fighting against these mechanics, not using them for your own benefit. It is, again, a bad time all around. And who should we blame for the way Shinobi on NES turned out? That's tough to pin down. The game doesn't contain any credits, understandably, and digital code archaeology has only dredged up best guesses. Both the cutting room floor and Sega Retro have the developer pinned as Sanritsu, but that's not a definitive call. Still, someone created this game, and Tengen foisted it upon an unwitting, undeserving audience. They all know what they did, and they should all feel bad about themselves. Shame. 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 Thankfully, Tengen made amends for Shinobi almost immediately by also bringing us a fantastic conversion of Namco's Rolling Thunder. Although honestly, these games have so much in common, and the gulf in quality between these two cartridges is so immense that it just makes the NES version of Shinobi seem all the more offensive by comparison. Wow, I guess this is kind of awkward, huh? As I've said many times over on Segaiden, Sega's true rival in the 80s wasn't Nintendo, it was Namco. Sega didn't really turn their console business into their primary moneymaker until the 90s. Before that, after really, Sega saw its biggest successes in arcades. Nintendo had almost entirely bowed out of the arcade biz after the Famicom hit it big in the early 80s. After Punch-Out and arm wrestling, Nintendo's arcade machines amounted to paid demo stations for NES releases. Meanwhile, Namco churned out hit after hit in arcades, constantly keeping pace with Sega's hardware innovations, with the two companies constantly trading places at the top of the monthly arcade rankings polls. This too would continue well into the 1990s, with tit-for-tat inventions like the System-to-NES and Model 1 boards keeping the two companies at the bleeding edge of game tech. Throughout all of this, it was hard to shake the sensation that Sega and Namco were cribbing from one another's notes. One company would release a game that would see a very similar competing follow-up arrive in short order, imitating the beats of the earlier title while improving on it. Case in point, Shinobi and Rolling Thunder. Both games share a similar dynamic, with a focus on ranged combat in a side-scrolling space that allows players to switch quickly between different levels of ground by performing high or ducking jumps. Rolling Thunder came first, and it was pretty fantastic. Shinobi arrived a year later, shamelessly lifting a ton of play mechanics from Namco's game, but improving on it by incorporating the aforementioned contextual short-range strikes when enemies move in close, making it a much friendlier experience than Rolling Thunder, where protagonist Albatross tends to crumple like paper when enemies dash in too close for him to shoot them with his lanky firing stance. Of course, both games owe their existence to Capcom's Ghosts and Goblins. Heck, Rolling Thunder even does the thing where you reach the end of the game and have to play back through a second, more challenging gameplay loop in order to face the actual final boss. But they're faster, more freewheeling games than Capcom's hit, not to mention less unfairly punishing. Both still love to hit you with surprise attacks, and Rolling Thunder in particular combines carefully placed gotcha ambushes with just enough random enemy behavior that you have to commit the layout of each stage to memory but still need to stay on your toes to counter the unpredictable whims of the bad guys. In arcades, Shinobi presented a more varied sandbox of action, with a wider host of enemies, less rigid enemy placement, more varied combat options, and an interesting goal-based design that required players to rescue abducted ninja apprentices in order to complete a stage. Shinobi also included far more verticality to its level design than Rolling Thunder, It presented players with a challenging boss at the end of each stage, and it featured an 80s-style Hollywood ninja rather than a 60s-style man-from-uncle like Secret Agent. In all respects, a richer, more of-the-moment game experience. Advantage: Sega. In arcades, anyway. On NES, Rolling Thunder mops the floor with the ragged corpse of Tengen's Shinobi. It's probably not a fair comparison. Sega's console development teams were stretched pretty thin during the Master System era, and they often farmed out development on games to ghost developers and partner studios. You'd better believe that Sega didn't waste any of its precious internal talent on NES game programming. They had bigger and more familiar fish to fry. Namco, on the other hand, maintained a pretty resolute approach to Famicom development even after finding themselves at odds with Nintendo's business practices. They developed a great many of their own Famicom releases internally, and when they farmed out their work, they generally tapped top-tier studios who really understood the hardware. In the case of Rolling Thunder, they hired Arc System Works. I've actually seen a fair amount of Arc System Works on Segaiden. They ported both Double Dragon and Vigilante to Master System for Sega, uncannily predicting a future where they would own the full rights to Double Dragon. Those ports were pretty solid, and Double Dragon had a lot more in common with the arcade original than the NES conversion did. And yet, Arc had an even better handle on the NES hardware. This port of Rolling Thunder looks about as good as the NES could have managed, and it plays almost perfectly. It captures the speed and precision of the arcade game, from the slick dual height jumps to the consistent yet unpredictable behavior of the weird hooded goons. And of course, the dual loop. Rolling Thunder is just as tough on NES as in the arcade, but Arc incorporated a password system into the cartridge so that you don't have to play from the start every time you die, which is good because Rolling Thunder kills you a lot. It almost feels like a predecessor to Kaizo games, or more accurately, to troll games like I Wanna Be the Guy. It's one of the first action games where you can tell the developers sat down with playtesters, took careful notes on their behaviors and instinctive responses, and then arranged enemies to punish them for following their gaming intuition. In arcades, it could be kind of frustrating. But when you don't have to blast through a coin every 30 seconds, it's more funny than frustrating to have, for example, a hooded goon drop down from nowhere the instant you reach what appears to be the safe haven of a door. See, taking a page from Taito's Elevator Action, a fellow Cold War spy action game, Rolling Thunder allows you to duck into doorways in order to avoid bad guys. Unlike in Elevator Action, though, you won't find mission objectives inside of these safe havens. In fact, it's not especially useful to enter a door with enemies on screen, because they see you nip into the room on the other side and will mill around the exit, waiting to attack you the second you leave. You really only want to use the specially marked doors that dispense ammunition, either refills for your standard pistol or a rapid-fire submachine gun that replaces the single-action handgun. The longer you wait inside an ammo door, the greater the stockpile you can amass. You can finish the game without ever collecting a power-up, though. Although you start with a limited amount of ammo at the beginning of each stage, your pistol never actually runs dry. It's just that once the ammo counter hits 0, you're reduced to a much slower firing rate, which leaves you vulnerable. I suppose the premise is that you've run out of clips and have to chamber extra rounds individually. Whatever the case, it's annoying to have no ammo, but you can still technically complete the game in this state. I wouldn't recommend it though. The bad guys mostly consist of hooded henchmen working for the Geldra organization, whose costumes make full use of the NES color palette. The color of a Geldra goon's outfit signals their preferred forms of attack, which range from the garish low-level guys who just walk around and try to punch you, to the rare but deadly guys dressed in solid white, who can gun you down with gusto and require multiple hits to take out. Given how much these latter guys resemble KKK ghouls though, taking them out is a pleasure. Later in the adventure, you have to fight bizarre mutant creatures like man-bats and strange guys who leap around while on fire. This is your first clue that you are not, in fact, facing a normal guy as the villain. The final boss is a guy named Mabu, who looks almost exactly like Piccolo from Dragon Ball, although technically Piccolo didn't show up in the manga until a couple of years after Rolling Thunder hit arcades, so I suppose it's the other way around. Anyway, Mabu runs Geldra in order to take over the world with his army of fashion-challenged Cobra Commander cosplayers, an ambition which he has decided to realize by kidnapping protagonist Albatross's secret agent comrade, Leela. I guess there were no princesses handy to abduct. The game treats Leela as an objective, but also as a sort of titillating reward, displaying her current state of being on the big Geldra 8K television between stages. You will not be surprised to learn that she grows progressively more naked and progressively more abused as the game advances, which could help account for why this one showed up from Tengen rather than under Nintendo license. Unlike Afterburner, Rolling Thunder did not show up as an unlicensed release so that Tengen could make use of the unique mapper chip featured in the Famicom cart. Arc designed Rolling Thunder around the Japan-only Namco 163 chip, but Tengen converted the code to their own bespoke ROM. And that's okay. The Namco 163 wasn't essential to the smooth operation of Rolling Thunder, as opposed to Afterburner's reliance on the Sunsoft 4 chip. All Namco's chip did was to introduce additional audio channels so that Rolling Thunder's soundtrack could approach the sublime greatness of the arcade cabinet's music. Not only did that not affect the moment-to-moment operation of the game code, it also wasn't available as a feature on NES. Nintendo relocated the expansion pins that made audio enhancements possible from the Famicom's cartridge slot to the unused expansion port on the bottom of the NES. Otherwise, Rolling Thunder plays exactly the same on NES as on Famicom, with the one notable change coming in the ending. On Famicom, you get a cool image of Albatross and Leela kicking ass together, but on NES, Leela just kind of cuddles up to her rescuer. Not that any of us had the skill to finish the game. The final run-up before reaching Mabu's Operations Center is one of the most vexingly difficult sequences on NES. So hard that it even laughs at the weak sauce design of Ninja Gaiden's final stage. Anyway, Rolling Thunder on NES is a much better take on its source material than Tengen's similar but vastly worse Shinobi cartridge. It is funny though to see two games that share such a close conceptual relationship arrive as unlicensed cartridges in rapid succession, denying the core NES fanbase that did their shopping at retailers who shunned Tengen access to this style of game. Thankfully, Arc System Works stepped in and put things right a few months later via Capcom's Codename Viper. Codename Viper would turn out to be the biggest Rolling Thunder ripoff you could possibly imagine, and it was indeed developed by Arc. We'll get to that one in due time, but for now, toward the end of 1989, Rolling Thunder kind of brings Sega's run on NES to a muted close. Tengen's Sega games were mostly pretty decent, but Rolling Thunder stomps them into a mud hole, especially that janky rendition of Rolling Thunder clone Shinobi. Next time on NES Works, more unlicensed stuff, probably.